their phones and get warm. I mean, what are you crazy? You know, I told people I'm doing a talk on jazz 10:30 on a Sunday morning, and the most common response was, "Oh, gee, it's 10:30 on a Sunday morning." It's like, I didn't know that. But this is great. There's no traffic. It's easy to get up here, and thank you so much for coming, everybody. Let me step aside here for a minute. We'll wait for everybody to get settled just a little bit. I've got about an hour's worth of material this morning. I'm going to try to tell the story mostly through the slides. We have a few musical examples. I'll be talking a lot, and we'll try to move quickly and get out of here so we can move on to the rest of our day. But this is just great to be here with you all. So I'll tell you what, why don't we start? First of all, my topic, as you can see this morning, is from Ragtime to Jazz, early days in Seattle, 1900s and 1920. I'm not a musicologist, I'm a historian. And I'm not going to explain how ragtime tunes are structured. That's not my thing. I'm going to be talking about the history, the transition period from 1900 to 1920, and specifically on how it was felt and heard in Seattle. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge, as we talk about jazz history, we have 89 years of jazz history here this morning. Julian Priester is here, one of the great trombonists in jazz history, certainly of the second half of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century. He's my good luck charm. He'd like to remind you that he was not around for when this music was made, and neither was I. So I hope it's a good learning experience for
Ken, I'm going to interrupt here really quick.
Pardon?
Can everybody hear Ken enough, or should we set up a microphone really quick?
Microphone.
We're going to do a microphone really
You
quick.
want to do a microphone? Okay,
Yeah,
great.
let's do it real quick.
And then I have two more stools. So if another one needs a stool, just back here. So.
This is such a thrill. I don't get to talk into microphones very often. I did in my long ago past, I did a radio program for WPFW in Washington, D.C., and we used to talk about the radio disease, where you get addicted to microphones. And so this morning I'll be having a relapse. So I'll tell you what, I'll get started. I'll just try to increase the volume as Max sets up. Is that okay?
Yeah. Sure.
Okay, great. Everyone good with about an hour this morning? Yep. Okay, great. This exploration this morning from Ragtime to Jazz was prompted by this ad from 1918 that appeared in Seattle's African American newspaper, Peyton's Weekly. It advertises an event to be held at Washington Hall featuring Miss Lillian Smith's jazz band. I was scheduled to give this presentation in May of 2020. COVID intervened. It was rescheduled 2 times. I finally gave the presentation in 2022 at Washington Hall. It was the intervening period, the delay was good because it allowed me to do more research. I mean, basically that's what I do now that I'm not working for the bank. I sit at my computer and just Google stuff all day long. But in that intervening period, I found out a lot of information about Lillian Smith. Before then, she was just a name, and we'll get to that in a minute. Here's a picture of Washington Hall. How many people are familiar or have been to Washington Hall? Yeah, it's probably the most.
Is it in
on
Washington?
14th?
No, it's in Seattle, Washington. Yes. Is there another one?
I don't know. Well, Washington, D.C. I don't know.
Yeah, used to live there.
Ken, it's on 14th?
Yes, it is. It's at 14th and Fur, 1 block north of Yesler.
Yes.
This building was almost sold to a condo developer. Fortunately, the financial crisis in 2008 intervened 100 years after the building was built. Historic Seattle acquired the property put in a multi-million-dollar renovation. Here's the exterior of the building as it appeared in 1937. Here's the beautiful interior, completely redone. I don't know if these lights were part of the original setup, but they certainly create a very warm atmosphere. The stage was set for 2 pianists. Here's another picture of the interior. You can see how beautiful it is, how beautiful the dance floor is, the balcony. And then here's a picture I took in November of 22. I don't know how well you can see this. I was having some fun up in the balcony. I was talking, there's a living caretaker at Washington Hall who told me there are 4 ghosts, 3 happy ones and 1 angry one. I was kind of feeling it, so I took this picture. You see Bernie Jacobs and Phil Sparks reflected in the window of Washington Hall at night. Really a special place in Seattle. My musical heroes are Billy Strayhorn and Duke Ellington. I'm really an Ellington guy. This is a new area of exploration for me. I've become really interested in the pre-jazz or early jazz period, as I mentioned, from 1900 to 1920. Just as a way to introduce myself, I know a lot of you, but some of you I don't know. I've given talks like this about Duke Ellington around the world. Stockholm, New York, London, Amsterdam, Portland, Oregon. I'm not sure how that got in there. And Paris. And I like to tell people I'm probably better known in Paris than I am in Seattle. The problem is I only know about 5 people in Paris. I have a question for you. How many people here have ever given a PowerPoint presentation? Yeah, a lot of you. Does the PTSD kick in? I know mine has, but I'm so happy to see that everything's working this morning. But a quick story. This is from the Duke Ellington Conference in Amsterdam from 2014. I had discovered that Duke Ellington appeared in a silent movie in 1925. It had been completely unknown. It laid in the archives of the Library of Congress where they restored the film, and I was all excited to show clips of this film to 200 people who would be as excited as I was about this. I talked to the organizer of the conference. I said, Walter, I need to do a run-through of my presentation. They go, oh, no, we don't have time. And these people at these conferences, they always say, oh, no, we're going to use our laptop. Oh, your presentation will work just fine. Well, I got up there on this beautiful stage. State of the art isn't even the word for it. The Royal Conservatory in Amsterdam. The presentation doesn't work. Fortunately, my friend David Palmquist, sitting in the front row, realized what was going on, switched out laptops, which takes a while because you have to boot one down and then hook up the other one and then boot it back up to get the presentation going. So here I was on stage for 5 minutes that felt like they lasted about 5 years. And a higher force took over. I'm not feeling it today, but I felt it that day. And the nice thing about it was afterward, Mercedes Ellington, Duke Ellington's granddaughter, said, Ken, you've got great stage presence. So I hope, by 10 years later, I hope we still got it.
Just
Okay.
point that mic a little more at your mouth.
Okay, great. How's that?
Point it, yeah, like that, like a singer.
Let me hear you say yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. Okay, great. Enough about me. I want to first of all, well, not first of all, but I do want to give credit to Paul DeBarros. He's the one who wrote the history of jazz in Seattle. This is his book. That's Oscar Holden, pianist Oscar Holden, the patriarch of Seattle jazz, on the front cover. Without Paul, a lot of information would have been lost. He interviewed in the 1980s many of the Seattle greats from the 20s, 30s, and 40s while they were still here. I did tons of research, library research in newspapers when you had to do it the old-fashioned way on microfilm. And the thing I really like about Paul, is he's very generous with his research. There's some people out there, when they find something, they hang on to it. Paul is more than willing to admit that there's something that he doesn't know. And I send stuff to him all the time, and just great, and he's continuing to do great things here in Seattle. And we move on, I just want to make a brief acknowledgement. I think many of you have been to concerts or presentations where the presenter opens the presentation by acknowledging that we live on the unceded land of the Duwamish people. And how about also acknowledging that we destroyed the natural paradise they lived in for 10,000 years. We're gonna connect this to jazz. This is what Seattle looked like up until 1851. This is the water lines map. The key word to learn here is palimpsest. Something reused or altered, but still bearing traces of its original form. Think of a painting by a Renaissance master where they discover that underneath the painting was another painting that the artist might not have liked, scrape the oils off, or just painted over it. We've done the same thing here in Seattle. We've created a city on top of what was here before. How am I doing with the sound?
Good.
Okay? Not so good?
Louder.
Okay. This is a drawing of what's now Pioneer Square. This is known as the crossing over place, or Dietzelich. We're gonna move ahead in time to a map that was drawn in 1856 following the Battle of Seattle. There were two lines of thought among the natives here in Seattle. Chief Seattle was saying, well, we're not gonna be able to beat these people, we have to accommodate them, and this is the only way we're gonna see a future. Chief Leshai did not like that. He said, well, basically, we're screwed. I'm gonna go down fighting. The battle did not last. It was not successful from the natives' part. And the city grew. Here's a picture, oh, yeah, excuse me, let's, again, this name, Zizilalich. I think this is how you pronounce it. I've got this off of various sources. I don't think I have the pronunciation quite correct. Here's that map I was telling you about, showing, yeah, thank you. Great, thanks, Matt. Here's the map I was talking about. We can see the little crossing over place right here. Here's Yesler's Mill, right here, the famous Yesler's Mill. Yesler was the dividing line between the Denny Platte and the Doc Maynard Platte. The Denny's were rather conservative. Doc Maynard liked to play cards. He was a businessman. He was accused of being an Indian lover, which he was okay with. This area here, the Tidal Lagoon, was getting filled in quite quickly with debris from Yesler's Mill. By 1861, excuse me, yes, by 1861, John Pinnell from San Francisco opened a brothel called the Elahi House. By this point, they had already been filling in the lagoon, so this was built on sawdust. And Yesler became the dividing line between virtue and vice in Seattle. To put this in current perspective, and I think this is pretty amazing, because this was an important place to the native population. This was a gathering place. It was also the quickest route to get across the isthmus to Lake Washington. But to put this in modern perspective, this overlay was done by historian Clarence Bagley in 1930 to help us understand where these historical places were located. And my friend Mita Reichart, who's here, helped me prepare this map to annotate it one more time in 2024 to show a couple of gathering places that we in the jazz community have had. Bud's Jazz Records at First South and Jackson. Everybody, well, there's a lot of people who are not old enough here to remember Bud's, but may have seen you there browsing through the vinyl. And then just one block to the north at First and Main is a fantastic new community organization known as the Seattle Jazz Fellowship. Now, again, a gathering place for those of us who love this music. Here's a picture I took yesterday. You can see the sign for Dieselovich, and the Seattle Jazz Fellowship is located in this building right here, just on the other side of First Avenue South. Following up on the map of Pioneer Square, here's a map from the new Jackson Street Jazz Trail website. This is a wonderful project. Paul DeBarros was also involved on this with many other organizations. There's a virtual tour of the historic jazz spots available. This is on the net, you can find it. I'm just going to talk mostly about two different spots today. First, to the far left or to the west is the Dumas Club, where Frank Walden played starting in 1912, we think. And on the far right, here's Washington Hall. I want to talk a little bit about Seattle and where it was at in 1900. This is your best resource right here, Dr. Quintard Taylor's book, The Forging of a Black Community. It gives us some population numbers. In 1900, they counted 80,000 people in Seattle, only 400 black residents. It was a small community. Seattle boomed in the first decade with the wealth that was coming down from Alaska and the extraction industries and the financial services built on top of that. The population of Seattle went from 80,000 to 237,000 in 10 years. The black population grew too, but was still small, only 2,894 people. Seattle was certainly a breath of air from Jim Crow conditions that were across the South, but it was no paradise out here either. But you can understand how musicians from the South, when they came out here, said, you know, I kind of like it here. Let's talk about the music world of 1900. Ragtime was debuted at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. It became a national fad. Its leading practitioner was Scott Joplin. I think I'm going to move to a seat. I just averted a disaster there. Okay, so Scott Joplin, born in Texarkana, Texas on November 24th. My gosh, this is his birthday, 1868. He moved to Sedalia, Missouri in 1894 and started publishing music. In 1899, he published Maple Leaf Rag. It was a big hit. Hits being registered by the sales of sheet music. It was said to be the first million seller in sheet music. And a common trend in American music, that was an innovation from African Americans, quickly became adopted by everyone. It was a rage. In 1900, the piano was at a peak of popularity. Every good home had one. Thanks to, here's Maple Leaf Rag here. Why don't we take a little listen? Okay, I think everyone's familiar with Maple Leaf Rag.
Yeah, all
So-
piano players will get excited when they hear that.
Coming up next will be Matt Grout with piano renditions of their favorite tunes. Okay, so Maple Leaf Rag became a big hit. And, you know, I wanted to mention in discussing or getting ready for this presentation, I talked to my friend John Edward Hassey, who wrote the most succinct biography of Duke Ellington. I didn't know that he was also a ragtime expert. And he edited this compilation of 21 essays. There's so much material on ragtime. He pointed out to me that there were 6 ragtime compositions that were published in Seattle. Here are 2 of them. The Rag with No Name by Warren Camp. I believe that's Warren Camp sitting at the piano with Brink. I don't know Brink's first name. I'm guessing he was the vocalist. And then we also have, and I was able to find the sheet music. Just, I mean, it's amazing what you can find out on the nets these days. The Potlatch Tickle. Both of these were from 1911. This one by Donald A. Robertson. Here's another one. I really love this cover of the Alaska Rag. This was written by Alec M. Mullen. Alec lived at 5641 6th Avenue Northwest in Ballard. It's not on our Jackson Street Trail map. Mullen's history is really interesting when you look at the trajectory of his life. In 1915, he published this tune. In 1916 and 1917, he was playing a lot of graduation parties. He was just getting out of high school at that point. Mullen went into the Army in 1918. He married in 1919. He married Bertha Rickles. And in 1920, Alec Mullen became a dad. And this was rather stunning to me as a member of the patriarchy. I was looking in the Seattle Star where they had the birth announcements. They listed the fathers and not the mothers. And then the child would be identified as boy or girl. That was in 1920. And again, this really struck me as I could relate to this. After 1920, we don't hear of Alec Mullen again until 1963, 43 years later, and this gifted ragtime composer had been working for the government. And he also played organ at the religious meetings of a fraternal organization in Ballard. And Dr. Hassey also let me know and that Alec Mullen's papers are held at the University of Washington. So this is what happens when you do research. You find out one thing and it opens up 5 other avenues to explore. And I haven't had time to make it to the University of Washington. But I'll tell you what, let's hear a little bit of Alaska Rag. This, by the way, is not a piano player, but this is, chances are some of you know about this more than I do. It's called a MIDI piano, where I believe they can take a score and feed it into a computer that will generate the sound of the piano or make a piano play. But as you can hear, this is really a lovely tune. Moving on, speaking of the University of Washington, in 1909, a World's Fair was held here, the Alaska Yukon Pacific exhibition. As part of that, there was an area called the Pay Street, which was a block filled with entertainment venues. One of them was dedicated to black music. It was called, as you can see, Dixieland. One of the really interesting things about this picture is that Jimi Hendrix's paternal grandmother is probably in this photo. She was one of the singers and dancers in the show. She ended up marrying one of the stagehands, who was Jimi Hendrix's grandfather. It's an amazing story. The promoter of this band, this Dixieland band that was from Chicago, ran out of money, and the entertainers were stranded in Seattle. The Seattle Times launched a campaign to raise money to bail these people out, which was really remarkable. Jimmy's grandparents, and their names again, Bertram Philander Hendricks, and he married Zenora or Nora Moore. Several years ago, I was doing research tracking Duke Ellington's travels across North America in the 1930s and 40s. And looking in the Vancouver Sun, I found this amazing photo describing the night before, when Ellington played a dance. The man on the far right is 90 years old, who's rather shocked to see jitterbuggers. And we see three couples dancing, really beautiful photos of dancers being in the moment, enjoying the music. I didn't learn until a few years ago, there was a tremendous Jimi Hendrix show at the Northwest African American Museum. The couple second from the right are Jimi Hendrix's father and his aunt, who were a jitterbug dancing team who won many competitions. They moved to Seattle the following year. In 1942, they had a baby named Jimmy. So getting back to our time span, it's hard to talk about the past with not talking about what happens later, and at some points we'll bring this into the future. But again, let's get back to our Ragtime to Jazz time span. Here's a photo, a lovely photo that I've been using to do publicity about this event. This is a group, they call themselves the Wang Doodle Quintet in 1915. Wang Doodle had like many words, had a lot of different meanings. I think back then it was meant to mean peppy or really great or really lively orchestra. I went to the Urban Dictionary to see if they had a definition for Wang Doodle, and like many terms, and don't pull out your phones, there's a new meaning to Wang Doodle, and it's rather vulgar, and so let's forget that and talk about this remarkable band. The gentleman sitting in the front with the mandolin looks like quite a force right there. That's Ace Brooks. He was the manager of the band, the business manager of the band. He was involved, he was at the Alaska Yukon Pacific exhibition. He was a singer in a cakewalk contest. And this group, which we call proto-jazz or pre-jazz, played a lot of vocals, or did a lot of vocals, and he certainly would have been important to that. On the right, standing up with the cornet, is that a cornet or a trumpet, Michael?
Cornet.
Cornet, okay, great. That's Frank Waldron. Really hard to overestimate his importance to music in Seattle. He moved up from San Francisco following the earthquake in 1906. By 1907, he was performing in a trio with Ace Brooks, and by 1912, they were performing at the Dumas Club. Now let's talk a little bit about this pianist. Look back on this group. The woman on the right, her name is Cody Jones, and again, not much was known about her. At least I didn't know much about her until
some of my friends, I have a number of friends who are research geeks, and they've done all the genealogy on their family. They've identified their 6 cousins around the world, and they've got no genealogy left to do on their family. So they love it when I throw them a project to find out. And here's what we found out about Cody Jones. Excuse me as I stumble around here for a second to look for my notes. Well, Cody was born, well, I know most of this. So Cody was born in 1890 in Los Angeles. Her parents moved shortly thereafter to Seattle. Paul DeBarros tells it that she was the organist at the Grace Presbyterian Church at 24th and Madison. Excuse me for just a second here, please. Yeah, and I think the important thing that's really struck me about looking at this photo of Cody Jones is how important women were to early jazz. Remember I mentioned that the piano had reached the peak of popularity. Every good home had one. And guess who would be playing the piano? Who was at home? Jelly Will Morton later said that growing up in the 1890s, he considered the piano a women's instrument and felt that this was going to cast aspersions on his own personality. But I just don't think you can, overstate her importance to the band. Now, Frank Waldron had an advanced understanding of harmony. I can only imagine how Cody and Frank dealt with each other. Frank was known as being a hard drinker, abusive, gruff, and Cody was his pianist for several years, so I can just imagine the conversations between the two of them. It's like, Frank, no, that key's not gonna work. Here's another close-up of Cody. What I found out about her is that, remember I mentioned she was the church organist. She ended up marrying literally the son of a preacher man, Eugene Johnson. She became Cody Jones Johnson. Shortly thereafter, after their wedding, they moved to Los Angeles. Eugene was a pharmacist and opened a drugstore, a pharmacy as they called it. Cody, the woman we see right here, went to the University of Southern California. She got her degree in pharmacy also. It was called the B Pharm back then. It was a degree needed to practice pharmacy. Together they opened their own pharmacy. She stayed involved in the community. She was an officer in the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. Cody continued to be active in social groups around the city, and she played piano at those performances, so she continued to play piano. Eugene and Cody, they had 2 children also named Eugene and Cody. And if you're in Los Angeles, if you meet anyone named Eugene or Cody, you say, hey, is your great-grandmother, was she a pianist? This is one of those dreams. Hopefully, who knows, maybe there's someone in Los Angeles with a scrapbook, a photo album. That would just be great to see. Let's move on. Again, we're in 1914, a major event. We're backing up here a minute. Here's the Dumas Club where the Wang Doodle Quartet or Quintet played. Well, let's stick in 1914 again with the Wang Doodle Quartet. I'm just not used to paper. I don't know about you. This is an interesting experience for me. And doing research on the Wang Doodle Quintet, we found some amazing things. The Seattle Star, which was a lot spicier than the Seattle Times or the PI, had a lot more coverage of our favorite music. And I found out that for a week in 1914, the Bon Marché had a food show, and they hired Frank Waldron and his band to play during this exhibition of food products that the Bon Marché, maybe, I didn't know they used to sell food. So people were entertained as they were trying the peanut butter and the kippered salmon. And what's exciting about this is that we see on the left, and here's a close-up here, we see the set list. We find out what tunes they were playing in 1914. And this is rather stunning to me. And they had this for 5 different days. So we have the names of 50 different tunes that were in Frank Walden's repertoire. We also have a similar set list from 1910 and 1915. So let's take a look at what they played. They opened, and this is I'm guessing this is like a half-hour set, and it really moves along beautifully with the juxtaposition. And I just wanted an excuse to use the word juxtaposition. But they juxtapose tunes with style and rhythm and pacing to create, which is just a wonderful program. I found the covers for the sheet music of most of the tunes they played on February 12th, 1914. First, a march and two-step called Cuban Independence, written shortly after the end of the Spanish-American War. And that's followed by what's simply labeled as a song or a comic song. I'm not quite sure where the humor is in sailing down the Chesapeake Bay, but I just love this artwork. They followed that with a waltz from the 1870s, Whispering Waves, and then again, changing the pacing, changing the rhythm. They go to, again, a sentimental song, also from 1913. So they're playing the current music that's only a year old. There's a Girl in the Heart of Maryland. Maryland figured really big on that day. They go back to a march. They pick up the tempo, Constitution, a march and two-step, which I think we could also consider a rag. I know there's some people, scholars who will differentiate between the two. And then we move on, and don't you love this cover? A comic song, as they called it. What do you mean you lost your dog? They play 4 more tunes to end this half-hour or so program. Last night was The End of the World, a sentimental song. They also played a rag that we're going to hear from in a minute. Frank Waldron did a cornet feature playing a classical piece, and Schubert's Serenade, which is pretty remarkable. It gives you an idea of how well versed these musicians were. And then the set ended with the Tri-State March and two-step, and don't you just love that cover? I mean, the baseball fans out there. Here's the rag that they played. This was called Ramshackle Rag, and we don't have any recordings of Frank Waldron, but we do have this one. We do have a recording of this rag. This was recorded by Arthur Pryor. Arthur Pryor was the trombonist with John Philip Sousa. Sousa's considered a predecessor or a rag-influenced composer, but Arthur Pryor wanted to take it a little bit further. So let's hear this as an example of the kind of music that was being heard in Seattle in 1914. Now this is a larger orchestra, but I want you to get a feel for the rhythm and the sound of the music of 1914. Okay, a little taste of the sound of 1914. Also in 1914, a major event, the original Creole Orchestra from New Orleans became the first band from New Orleans to tour nationally. I'm a little bit out of order here, so let's jump ahead to the Creole band here. This is the cover of a book, one of my favorites, one of the finest pieces of jazz research I've ever read, by Lawrence Gushy, called Pioneers of Jazz. This describes the Creole band traveling the country. In 1914, they made it to Seattle and played at the Pantages Theater down on 2nd Avenue. Here's an ad again from the Seattle Star. The group is listed as New Orleans Creole musicians, the famous Southern Ragtime Orchestra. So it's 1914. They're still calling it ragtime. The group, and I really recommend, if you don't have enough stuff to read already, pick up Pioneers of Jazz. The group had the original New Orleans instrumentation, the front line, a trombone, cornet, and clarinet. They also had a violinist, stand-up string bass player, not the tuba, drums, and guitar. Here's a photo of Freddie Keppard, who was the cornet player with the Creole band. Legendary. He's said to have had the opportunity to record and to have made the first jazz record, but he didn't want anyone stealing his stuff. I believe he may have later regretted that decision and did record in the 20s when he was past his prime and music styles had changed. This is one of those questions we just can't answer, but maybe someday we will. But I wonder, where did the Creole band stay when they spent a week in Seattle? Certainly south of Yesler, perhaps in the Coast Hotel or in one of the many smaller hotels that dotted the area that you see on the maps. Who knows, maybe they found someone to spend the night with. They probably, I'm guessing they probably played after hours somewhere in Seattle. That Seattle musicians heard them. It was a close-knit community. I think at this point we're at a good point to talk about the etymology of jazz, the derivation of the word jazz. And at this point I must point you to another friend of mine, Dr. Lewis Porter at the Rutgers Institute of Jazz Study, who publishes on Substack. And he's recently done a series about the origins of the word jazz. And I suggest you check it for yourself, because he tells us that almost everything you've heard about the origins of the word jazz are not true. Ken Burns said that jazz came from the word jasmine, which was a perfume that could be detected in the bordellos in New Orleans. That's total BS, as far as I can tell. The word jazz comes from sports writers. In 1912, there was a pitcher in Los Angeles who said he threw a jazz ball. He said, it moves and you can't do anything with it. Here's an article from the San Francisco Chronicle from March of 1913. In praise of jazz, a futurist word which has just joined the language. The writer describes the the San Francisco Seals as having a vastly improved outlook for the 1913 season because they played with the jazz. The jazz meant they played with energy, they played with pep, they played with attitude. As we move on, as the word jazz is starting to become more common, we learn again from Lawrence Gushy that jazz wasn't used as really a noun to describe music until 1915. By then the word had become part of the vernacular of the vaudeville theater. In 1916 and 17, the word was in wide usage. Jazz could mean just about anything back then. any kind of dance music, any lively music, any novelty type music. If you see an old picture of a jazz band where the clarinetist is sticking the clarinet in his ear, I don't necessarily think that was jazz. Meanwhile, 1916, January 1st, Seattle gets a head start on Prohibition. You know, this could be a subject for a whole nother discussion. I mean, it seems so weird now. How could this possibly have been enacted? But I think the one thing that made it make sense to me was that there was an epidemic of violence against women that was fueled by alcohol. And that's where the Women's Christian Temperance Union got its start. Fortunately for Seattle, Prohibition created the ideal conditions for our favorite music. It's interesting, you could have alcohol, you could buy it, but you couldn't sell it. It was illegal to sell it. So jazz clubs became the ideal place to find alcohol. Prohibition begins, 1916. We're getting a little bit off jazz, but I just want to give you a portrait of the times. The Montlake Cut goes through. Lake Washington is lowered by 9 feet. The Black River, the center of the native population where the salmon runs were, dries up. At the same time, the Duwamish River was being straightened. In other words, in 60 years after the landing of the Denny Party, nature's been destroyed. 1917, wow, the world events are moving along. The United States enters World War I in April of 1917. And almost concurrently, the first jazz recording is made in February, issued in May, and it's in record stores in Seattle and Tacoma. So we're going to hear a bit of the original Dixieland Jazz Band with Livery Stable Blues. Okay, so the cat's out of the bag. First jazz record's out. The word is spreading. It becomes a fad, like just about every other music trend or popularity, whether it's disco or whatever. People jump on it quickly. If Herbie Mann had been alive in 1917, he probably would have made a ragtime album. But this is, we're hearing the original Dixieland Jazz Band. This is 1917. Bands calling themselves jazz bands are proliferating everywhere, but we don't know what they're really playing. We're going to take a look. Again, I followed up on a lead from Paul DeBarros. He mentioned that at Camp Lewis, now Joint Base Fort Lewis McChord, that there was an article in a special newspaper that was available only on the military bases called Trench in Camp. He mentions that there was a man named Bobby Hayes, who the Trench in Camp refers to as the originator of ragtime. This is news to me because I thought it was Joplin and James Stark and those other people. So it prompted me to try to get a hold of the Trench in Camp. And it's kind of exciting actually that it's not available online. A lot of this stuff, you know, that I used to spend hours rolling through microfilm to find, now you can, you know, search the web in your pajamas at, 3 in the morning and make great jazz discoveries. So I drove down to Tacoma. It was a great excuse. to learn about what was going on at Camp Lewis and to find this article. Camp Lewis was the largest military base, army base on the West Coast. It had as many as 45,000 soldiers during World War I. Here I am at the beautiful northwest room of the Tacoma Public Library. I believe I may be the only person who has ever taken a selfie with a microfilm reader. Here's a close-up of that article. The originator of jazz in the 347th Orchestra, Bobby Hayes. Again, my friends, the research geeks, I call them, went to work. We couldn't really, with the name Bobby Hayes, we couldn't really find him anywhere. We couldn't find him in the San Francisco newspapers. We did find that he played with the Palace Orchestra, and we found a few events. But Bobby Hayes still remains a mystery. But listen to how the paper, and this must have been written by, I'm guessing this was written by a soldier on the base. They really had not much to do while waiting to be shipped to France. They'd march for a couple of hours, they could take classes, they played a lot of music. And here's what they'd say about Bobby Hayes. He has so many different kinds of technique that there seems to be no limit to the things he can do with the weird outfit that comprises the stock of the trap. That's his drums. If there is anything to be done to a piece of music to make it deliciously creepy and crawly, to make it start gently up the Steiner column, just touching the centers of each vertebra, and then skylarking back again, sounds pretty good to me. And one of his specialties were the effects he can make with a slide whistle. So my feeling is they may have called this jazz, but I'm not sure whether we would recognize this as jazz today. I was really shocked to find in going through the Camp Lewis newspaper that every regiment had a band, and within every regiment they formed a jazz band. Here's an example going back to Bobby Hayes. They played the Tacoma Hotel. They didn't just play events on the base, they played the Tacoma Hotel. I mean, who knew that Tacoma was a hotbed of jazz in 1917? Speaking of all these different units, here's the 166 Jazz Orchestra. The copy doesn't look really well, but you can see the banjo player on top of the piano and doing weird stuff. In addition to excuse me, I'm a little bit out of order here. In addition to this 166 Jazz Orchestra that played for the YMCA for 1,100 men, the 91st Infantry played at Tacoma's Commercial Club. Then Company 1 of the 363rd played a jazz celebration for Christmas. And who are these people? A 14-piece jazz orchestra from the Seattle Construction and Dry Dock Company goes down to play Tacoma. You know, Sherman set the Wayback Machine for 1917. And this is funny. This is, I found this postcard for sale on eBay. This is a typical YMCA social night crowd at Camp Lewis. This, I guess they must have been sitting still so the photographer could take the photograph in a room that's not well illuminated. I just, you know, again, my imagination runs wild thinking, what did these soldiers do after the show? Use your own imagination there too and fill in the blanks. Frank Waldron moved down to Tacoma to take advantage of the jazz scene. And in 1918, he self-published his composition, The Kaiser's Got the Blues. I should mention this is a recreation of the tune by Greg Ruby. This is just a beautiful project that Greg Ruby found this music, put a band, or had his band perform the music so we can hear what it sounds like. So let me see if I can get this to play.